In the last video, we watched a teenage prisoner become a king. We saw how Matthias Corvinus outmaneuvered the Hungarian nobility, seized the throne against all odds, and built something that had never existed before in Central Europe. A professional, loyal, feared army that answered to him and him alone. But that was just the beginning, because once Matthias had his army, he used it. And what he did next would shock the most powerful rulers on the continent. He didn't just defend Hungary, he went on the offensive, against emperors, against enemies on every front, expanding his reach further and further until he stood at the very peak of European power. But here's the question I want you to hold in your mind as we go through this. How does a king who reaches that kind of peak leave behind a kingdom that collapses within a generation? That answer is coming. And it's not what most people expect. By the time the Black Army was fully operational, Matthias Corvinus had transformed the military landscape of Central Europe. Other kings ruled through noble armies, unreliable, slow, and loyal only as long as it was convenient. Matthias had something different, a trained, salaried force that could march when he decided, fight how he commanded, and stay in the field as long as he needed. The question was, who do you point that kind of power at? Matthias's answer was almost reckless in its ambition. He pointed it at everyone. To the south, the Ottoman Empire loomed, the same power that had threatened to swallow Hungary for decades. Matthias fought them, held them back, earned a reputation as one of the few rulers in Europe capable of checking Ottoman expansion. But fighting the Ottomans was expected of a Hungarian king. That was survival. What Matthias did next was something else entirely. He turned west and set his sights on the Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick III was the Holy Roman Emperor, in theory, the supreme secular authority in all of Christendom. In practice, Matthias treated him like an obstacle to be removed. Their rivalry didn't start with a single dramatic confrontation. It built slowly. A grinding, decade-long contest over who would actually dominate Central Europe. Frederick had legitimacy. The titles, the alliances, the symbolic weight of imperial authority behind him. Matthias had something more useful, an army that actually worked. Throughout the 1470s, Matthias pushed west, campaign after campaign into Habsburg-influenced territory. He wasn't simply raiding for plunder, he was reshaping the political map. Every campaign was a calculated move designed to expand Hungarian influence and send an unmistakable message. The era of unchallenged imperial dominance in this part of Europe was over. But even by Matthias's standards, what happened in 1485 was extraordinary. Matthias Corvinus captured Vienna. Let that sink in. A Hungarian king, once a prisoner in a foreign cell, had just taken the capital city of the Holy Roman Emperor himself, and he didn't just occupy it temporarily, he moved in. Vienna became his royal residence. The emperor of the known world was forced to watch a rival king hold court in his own capital. In the courts of Europe, the message was impossible to ignore. Hungary was no longer a regional kingdom on the edge of the continent. Under Matthias, it had become a dominant power, feared by enemies, courted by allies, and respected by everyone in between. It was the peak of his military achievement, but it was only half of what made him remarkable. Because while his armies were conquering cities in the west, something equally extraordinary was happening back in Buda. Here is something that surprises most people when they first learn about Matthias Corvinus. For all his military genius, he may have been even more obsessed with books. Not casually, obsessively. At his royal court in Buda, Matthias was quietly building one of the most remarkable cultural institutions in 15th century Europe. Scholars, philosophers, artists, and humanists were invited from across the continent. Latin manuscripts were studied, classical Greek texts were translated and preserved, scientific treatises changed hands, works of history and poetry, many of them hand-illuminated with extraordinary craftsmanship, filled the shelves of what would become his greatest non-military achievement, the Bibliotheca Corviniana. At its height, contemporary observers considered it one of the greatest libraries in the world, not just in Central Europe, but rivaling the celebrated collections of the Italian Renaissance princes. That was the gold standard. And Matthias was meeting it. This wasn't just a vanity project. Matthias understood something subtle and important. Military power could make enemies fear you. Cultural power made the right people want to be near you. His court in Buda became a magnet for Renaissance thought at precisely the moment those ideas were spreading beyond Italy. Hungary, under Matthias, became a bridge, a place where the new intellectual energy of the age found a royal patron who genuinely understood its value. He didn't just fund the library, he shaped it. He negotiated directly with Italian scholars. He sent agents across Europe to acquire specific manuscripts. He invested in it the way other kings invested in castles and fortifications, because for Matthias, knowledge was a fortification. It reinforced his legitimacy. It elevated Hungary's standing. It signaled to Europe that this was not a crude frontier kingdom. It was a civilization. He was, in every sense, both a warrior and a Renaissance king, a combination so rare that historians still marvel at it today. And for a time, it all held together beautifully. Hungary was wealthy, organized, militarily dominant, culturally sophisticated, a kingdom shaped entirely by one man's will, which was, as it turned out, the problem. There is a pattern in history that repeats itself so often it almost feels like a law of nature. The qualities that make a great leader indispensable are often the same qualities that make everything collapse when they're gone. Matthias Corvinus kept power close. Every major decision, military, financial, diplomatic, cultural, flowed through him. He trusted his own judgment above institutional structures. He resisted delegating authority to systems that could function without his direct involvement. And for over 2 decades, this worked. Because he was extraordinary. His judgment was usually right. His will was strong enough to hold the entire apparatus together. But there was a crack in the foundation that no one could see while Matthias was alive. The Black Army answered to him, not to an institution, not to a crown, to a man. The library was his vision. Scholars came because of him. The funding existed because of his priorities. The centralized power that made Hungary so effective? It was centralized in one person. And then, in April of 1490, Matthias Corvinus died suddenly in Vienna. He was 47 years old. There was no strong, undisputed heir ready to step in. No institutional framework prepared to absorb the shock. No system built to function without the man who designed everything. The moment he was gone, the unraveling began. The Hungarian nobility had spent decades under Matthias's firm, often suffocating authority. The moment that authority vanished, they moved. Royal power was renegotiated almost immediately. Concessions were demanded. The carefully maintained balance that Matthias had held together through sheer force of will began to dissolve, piece by piece. And the Black Army, the fearsome professional force that had humiliated the Holy Roman Emperor and held back the Ottomans, began to fall apart almost overnight. Without consistent royal funding, without the commanding presence of the king who had created it and sustained it, the most feared military force in Central Europe simply came undone. Soldiers went unpaid, units fragmented, discipline evaporated. Some of these men who had once been the pride of Hungarian military power, resorted to looting just to survive. The very symbol of Hungarian strength became a symbol of its decline. Into this fractured landscape stepped the new king, Vladislaus II. Vladislaus was, in almost every way, the opposite of Matthias. Where Matthias had centralized, Vladislaus conceded. Where Matthias had commanded, Vladislaus accommodated. He earned a reputation, even among his own contemporaries, as a ruler who said yes too easily, bent to noble pressure too readily, and dismantled what remained of royal authority in exchange for a quiet reign. Within a generation, Hungary went from the most powerful centralized state in Central Europe to a fragmented, vulnerable kingdom where the king's authority was largely ceremonial. The Bibliotheca Corviniana? Much of it was dispersed, lost, or carried off. The Black Army? Disbanded. The empire Matthias had built? Gone. And this is where the story of Matthias Corvinus becomes something more than a history lesson about one brilliant king. Because what happened to Hungary after 1490 is not a story about bad luck or outside forces. It is a story about what happens when an entire system is built around a single person, and that person disappears. Matthias Corvinus was, by almost any measure, extraordinary. He took on the Ottoman Empire and held them. He humiliated the Holy Roman Emperor and seized his capital. He built a library that scholars across Europe envied. He turned a fractured medieval kingdom into a Renaissance power. He did all of it through the force of his own will, his own vision, his own relentless ambition. And in doing so, he made himself irreplaceable, which meant that everything he built was only ever one death away from collapse. In 1526, at the Battle of Mohács, the Ottoman forces that Matthias had once held back met a Hungarian army that was a shadow of what it had been. The result was catastrophic. The kingdom shattered. The Golden Age was over, 36 years after Matthias died. History remembers Matthias Corvinus as one of the greatest kings Hungary ever produced, but history also remembers what came after. Because sometimes, the seeds of an empire's fall are planted at the very moment of its greatest triumph.